The morning mist hung low over Central Park as Marcus Thornfield adjusted his Armani tie and checked his Patek Philippe watch for the third time in 5 minutes. His 4-year-old daughter Sophia bounced excitedly beside him on the park bench, clutching a half-eaten blueberry muffin and chattering about the ducks they'd just fed. At 38, Marcus had built Thornfield Industries into a tech empire worth $12 billion, but sitting here watching his daughter's pure joy over simple pleasures reminded him that success measured in stock prices couldn't buy moments like these. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh coffee from nearby vendors, a stark contrast to the sterile boardrooms where he spent most of his waking hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sophia had insisted on their Saturday morning ritual despite Marcus's packed schedule. Board meetings, merger negotiations, and investor calls could wait when his daughter's bright green eyes looked up at him with that mixture of determination and innocence that reminded him so much of her mother. Elena had passed away when Sophia was barely 2, leaving Marcus to navigate single parenthood while running a Fortune 500 company. Some days he felt like he was drowning in responsibilities, but moments like these kept him anchored to what truly mattered. As they walked along the tree-lined path toward Fifth Avenue, Sophia suddenly stopped mid-skip and tugged at Marcus's sleeve. Her small finger pointed toward a cluster of bare trees near the park's edge, where autumn shadows created pockets of darkness even in the morning light. There, hunched against the rough bark of an old oak, sat a woman wrapped in layers of torn clothing and faded blankets. Her dark hair hung in matted strands around a face that might have once been beautiful, now etched with lines of hardship and exhaustion. "Mommy, why is that lady sleeping outside?" Sophia asked in that piercing way children have of cutting straight to the heart of uncomfortable truths. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd spent years insulating his daughter from the harsh realities of the world, surrounding her with nannies, private schools, and gated communities, where poverty was an abstract concept rather than a lived reality. Now, faced with her innocent question, he found himself struggling for words that could bridge the gap between their privileged existence and the raw human suffering just yards away. "Sometimes people don't have homes like we do, sweetheart," he said carefully, his voice softer than usual. Sophia frowned, her 4-year-old mind working to process this information. But why doesn't someone help her? She looks cold. The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was his daughter, barely old enough to tie her shoes, instinctively understanding something he'd somehow forgotten in his climb to the top. When had he stopped seeing individual human beings and started seeing statistics? When had his world become so narrow that genuine suffering could exist at just blocks from his penthouse apartment without ever registering on his radar? Before he could formulate an answer, Sophia had slipped from his grasp and was walking purposefully toward the homeless woman. Marcus's protective instincts flared, but something in his daughter's determined stride reminded him of Elena's fearless compassion. He followed, staying close enough to intervene if necessary, but curious to see what his little girl would do. The woman looked up as Sophia approached, her brown eyes wide with surprise and wariness. Up close, Marcus could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 30s, with delicate features that spoke of a different life before whatever circumstances had led her here. Her clothes were clean despite their obvious wear, and she clutched a small leather journal against her chest like a lifeline. "Are you sleeping outside because you don't have a bed?" Sophia asked with the directness that only children possess. The woman's expression softened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the refined cadence of education and breeding. "I'm staying here for now, little one." Sometimes adults have complicated problems that are hard to explain. "My name is Sophia. What's yours?" "Victoria," the woman replied, and something in the way she said it made Marcus pay closer attention. There was weight behind that simple name, as if it carried memories she wasn't ready to share. Sophia reached into her small pink backpack and pulled out the second muffin Marcus had bought her, still wrapped in its bakery paper. "You can have this. My daddy always says sharing makes everything better." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the offering. "Thank you, Sophia. That's very kind of you." Marcus watched this exchange with growing fascination. Most homeless individuals he'd encountered in his limited interactions had seemed defeated, worn down by circumstances and society's indifference. But Victoria carried herself differently. Despite her obvious hardship, there was dignity in her posture, intelligence in her eyes, and something almost familiar about her mannerisms that he couldn't quite place. "Daddy, can we help Victoria find a home?" Sophia asked, turning to Marcus with absolute faith in his ability to solve any problem. "It's complicated, sweetheart," Marcus began, but Victoria interrupted gently. "Your father is right, Sophia, but your kindness today has already helped more than you know." As they walked away, Marcus found himself glancing back at Victoria multiple times. Something about her nagged at him, a sense of recognition that felt important but remained frustratingly elusive. That evening, as he tucked Sophia into her bed in their sprawling Upper East Side apartment, she brought up the encounter again. "Daddy?" Victoria seemed sad but not mean. "Why do people have to sleep outside?" Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and picture books, trying to find age-appropriate ways to explain systemic inequality and social injustice. Sometimes people face challenges that are bigger than they can handle alone. Mental illness, job loss, family problems. It's complicated. But we could help, couldn't we? We have extra rooms. Her innocent suggestion made Marcus smile despite himself. If only the world's problems could be solved with the pure logic of a 4-year-old. It's not that simple, princess. But your heart is in the right place. The next morning, Marcus found himself taking a detour through the park on his way to the office. He told himself it was about being a responsible citizen, checking on someone in his neighborhood who might need assistance. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about Victoria had lodged itself in his thoughts, demanding attention in a way that business deals and profit margins never could. She was there again, sitting in the same spot, but this time she was writing in her leather journal. As Marcus approached, he could see her handwriting was elegant, flowing across the page with practiced ease. When she noticed him, she quickly closed the journal and looked up with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You're Sophia's father," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Marcus Thornfield," he replied, extending his hand. She shook it briefly, and he noticed her grip was firm despite her obvious fragility. "She's a remarkable child. You should be proud." "I am." Marcus hesitated, then decided to be direct. "Listen, I know this might sound strange, but is there somewhere we could talk? Maybe grab some coffee? I'd like to understand your situation better." Victoria studied him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. "Why?" "Honestly, I'm not sure, but my daughter sees something in you that I think I'm missing. She has good instincts about people." After a moment, Victoria nodded. "There's a small cafe on Lexington that's usually quiet in the mornings. But I should warn you, I'm not looking for charity." "Good," Marcus replied. "Because I'm not offering any. I'm offering conversation." The cafe Victoria chose was indeed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Quiet. A hole-in-the-wall place with mismatched furniture and the kind of authentic atmosphere that Marcus's usual haunts lacked entirely. As they sat across from each other, he found himself studying her more closely. Despite her circumstances, Victoria possessed an innate elegance that expensive clothes and professional styling couldn't manufacture. Her bone structure was aristocratic, her vocabulary extensive, and her mannerisms spoke of a background in social refinement. "You're wondering how someone like me ended up sleeping in Central Park," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with steady hands. The thought had crossed my mind. Victoria was quiet for so long that Marcus began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, I had everything you probably think success looks like. Corner office, 6-figure salary, apartment on the Upper West Side. I was the senior vice president of marketing for Hartwell Communications. Marcus knew the company well. It was a mid-size firm that had made headlines a few years back for a major financial scandal. What happened? I discovered some irregularities in our client billing. Systematic overcharging. Ghost employees, inflated expense reports. When I tried to address it internally, I was told to keep quiet. When I couldn't, I became a problem that needed to be eliminated. The story Victoria told was familiar in its corruption but unique in its devastating personal consequences. She'd tried to blow the whistle on financial fraud, only to find herself framed for the very crime she'd attempted to expose. Her reputation was destroyed, her savings depleted by legal fees, her career prospects eliminated by a network of industry connections that painted her as unstable and vindictive. The worst part wasn't losing my job or my apartment, Victoria continued. It was watching people I'd considered friends cross the street to avoid me. Realizing that my entire social network was built on professional relationships rather than genuine connections. Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite himself. But surely there were appeals, ways to fight back? I tried everything: lawyers, journalists, regulatory agencies. But Hartwell had connections I didn't know existed, influence that reached into places I'd never imagined. Every door I tried to open had already been sealed shut. "So you've been homeless for 3 years?" Victoria shook her head. "The first year, I stayed with friends until I'd exhausted their patience and guest rooms. The second year, I worked temporary jobs and stayed in shelters when I could get space. But the background checks always caught up with me eventually. This past year has been the hardest." As Victoria spoke, Marcus found himself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion. Not pity, which would have been condescending, but genuine respect for someone who'd faced systematic destruction and somehow maintained her dignity. The woman sitting across from him hadn't been broken by her circumstances. She'd been refined by them. "The journal you were writing in," he said. "What is it?" For the first time, Victoria smiled, and the transformation was remarkable. "My story. Everything that happened, everyone who was involved, every detail I can remember. I keep thinking that someday, someone will want to hear the truth." Something clicked in Marcus's mind. A piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. "Victoria, what's your last name?" She hesitated, then met his eyes directly. "Sterling. Victoria Sterling." The name hit Marcus like electricity. Victoria Sterling had been all over the news 3 years ago, not as a whistleblower, but as the disgraced executive who'd allegedly embezzled millions from Hartwell Communications. He remembered the headlines, the perp walk photos, the industry gossip about another corporate climber who'd gotten too greedy. But sitting across from her now, seeing the intelligence in her eyes and the careful way she chose her words, he began to question everything he'd assumed about that story. "I know what you're thinking," Victoria said quietly. "I know what the headlines said, what people believe about me. Tell me what really happened." Over the next 2 hours, Victoria laid out a story of corporate malfeasance that was both shocking and entirely believable. She discovered that Hartwell's CEO, Richard Hartwell himself, had been systematically defrauding clients for years. When she'd tried to report it, she'd been set up as the fall guy. Evidence had been planted in her computer files, forged documents had been created with her digital signature, and witnesses had been coached to testify against her. "The most brilliant part of their plan was that they made me the perfect scapegoat," Victoria explained. "Single woman, ambitious, no family connections to cause problems. I was expendable." Marcus found himself believing every word. The details were too specific, too intricate to be fabricated. More importantly, the woman telling the story possessed an integrity that seemed incapable of the crimes she'd been accused of committing. "Why haven't you gone to the media with this? Who would believe the ravings of a homeless woman with a criminal record? Besides, Hartwell has connections at every major news outlet. The few journalists I managed to contact either ignored me or wrote dismissive pieces about delusional ex-convicts." As they parted ways that morning, Marcus gave Victoria his business card. "If you ever need anything, call me." She looked at the card, and he saw something flicker in her expression. "Thornfield Industries. I should have realized." "You know my company." "I know your reputation. You're one of the good ones, Mr. Thornfield. Your wife would be proud of the man you've become." The comment about Elena caught Marcus off guard. "How did you know about my wife?" "I read about her passing in the business journals." "She was involved in a lot of charitable work, wasn't she?" Children's hospitals. Education initiatives. Marcus nodded, suddenly feeling Elena's presence more strongly than he had in months. She would have seen immediately what he was only beginning to understand about Victoria Sterling. That evening, Marcus found himself in his home office long after Sophia had gone to bed, researching everything he could find about the Hartwell communications scandal. The more he read, the more convinced he became that Victoria was telling the truth. The timing of her accusations versus her alleged crimes, the convenience of the evidence against her, the speed with which she'd been prosecuted and convicted, it all pointed to a carefully orchestrated frame job. His research led him down a rabbit hole of corporate connections and industry relationships that painted a disturbing picture. Richard Hartwell wasn't just a CEO. He was a node in a network of wealthy executives who protected each other's interests, regardless of legality or ethics. Victoria had stumbled into something much bigger than simple billing fraud. By 3 in the morning, Marcus had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He was going to help Victoria Sterling clear her name, not out of charity or guilt, but because it was the right thing to do. More than that, it was what Elena would have done, what he hoped Sophia would do someday when faced with injustice. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Marcus used his connections to quietly hire the best private investigators in the city, tasking them with finding evidence to support Victoria's claims. He leveraged his company's resources to conduct digital forensics on publicly available information about Hartwell Communications. Most importantly, he began building relationships with journalists and prosecutors who might be willing to take a fresh look at a case everyone else considered closed. Throughout this process, Marcus found himself spending more time with Victoria. She moved from the park to a small apartment he rented for her under his company's name, claiming it was temporary housing for a consultant. The transformation was remarkable. Given access to proper nutrition, medical care, and basic dignity, Victoria bloomed like a flower that had been waiting for sunlight. But it was her mind that truly impressed Marcus. Victoria possessed a strategic intelligence that had been wasted on corporate marketing. She understood power structures, could anticipate moves and countermoves, and had an intuitive grasp of human nature that made her invaluable as they planned their approach to exposing the truth. Sophia, meanwhile, had taken to Victoria with the fierce loyalty that children reserve for people who treat them as equals rather than miniature adults. Victoria never talked down to her, never dismissed her questions, and showed genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. Watching them together, Marcus began to understand what had been missing from their small family unit. "She's brilliant," Victoria told him one evening as they watched Sophia work on a puzzle that was supposedly meant for children twice her age. "But more than that, she has emotional intelligence. She sees things adults miss because we've learned to ignore our instincts." "She saw something in you that first day," Marcus replied. "Something I almost missed." Victoria turned to look at him, and in that moment the air between them shifted. What had started as a mission of justice had become something more personal, more intimate. Marcus found himself drawn to Victoria, not just as a wronged person deserving of help, but as a woman whose strength and vulnerability called to something deep in his soul. The breakthrough in their investigation came from an unexpected source. One of Marcus's investigators had tracked down a former Hartwell employee named Janet Morrison, who had left the company abruptly around the time of Victoria's troubles. At first, Janet refused to talk, terrified of the legal and financial consequences of speaking out. But when she learned that Victoria was still alive and fighting to clear her name, something shifted. "I've been carrying this guilt for 3 years," Janet told Marcus during a clandestine meeting at his office. "I knew what they were doing to her, but I had kids to feed and a mortgage to pay." Janet's testimony was devastating. She'd been Richard Hartwell's executive assistant and had witnessed firsthand the planning sessions where Victoria's downfall had been orchestrated. She had copies of emails, recorded phone conversations, and detailed notes about meetings where evidence had been fabricated and witnesses coached. "Mr. Hartwell was obsessed with destroying her," Janet explained. "He saw her as a threat not just to his scheme but to his ego. The idea that some mid-level executive could bring him down was intolerable." Armed with Janet's evidence and months of additional investigation, Marcus arranged a meeting with Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, who had a reputation for taking on powerful corporate interests. Sarah was initially skeptical. The Hartwell story was old news, and Victoria Sterling's credibility was questionable given her conviction. But when Marcus presented the evidence package his team had assembled, Sarah's entire demeanor changed. Here was proof of systematic fraud, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and prosecutorial misconduct that went far beyond simple corporate malfeasance. "This isn't just about Victoria Sterling," Sarah said after reviewing the materials. "This is about a pattern of corruption that could implicate dozens of companies and hundreds of executives. Will you pursue it?" Sarah looked at the evidence again, then at Marcus. "Mr. Thornfield, if even half of this is true, it's the biggest corporate corruption story of the decade. Of course I'm going to pursue it." The article that appeared 6 weeks later sent shockwaves through the business community. The Victoria Sterling Frame, How Corporate America Destroys Whistleblowers, was a meticulously researched exposé that laid bare the entire conspiracy. Richard Hartwell's scheme, the evidence against Victoria, the network of corrupt executives who had protected each other. Everything was there in devastating detail. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Federal prosecutors reopened Victoria's case within days. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched a broad investigation into Hartwell Communications and its associates. Most importantly, public opinion shifted dramatically as people realized that Victoria Sterling hadn't been a criminal but a hero who had been systematically destroyed for trying to do the right thing. The legal proceedings that followed were swift but thorough. With Janet Morrison's testimony and the mountain of evidence Marcus's team had uncovered, Victoria's conviction was overturned and all charges dismissed. Richard Hartwell and 3 other executives were arrested on charges of fraud, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. The company itself was dissolved, its assets seized to compensate the clients who had been defrauded. But for Marcus, the most meaningful moment came when Victoria walked out of the courthouse, a free woman, her record cleared and her reputation restored. She stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters and supporters, but her eyes found his in the crowd. In that look, he saw gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Love, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. The media attention that followed was intense, but short-lived. Victoria became a symbol of corporate whistleblowing, speaking at conferences and consulting with organizations about ethical business practices. Several major companies offered her executive positions, recognizing that her experience and integrity made her invaluable in an era of increased regulatory scrutiny. But it was the quiet moments that mattered most to Marcus. Evenings spent in his apartment with Victoria and Sophia, reading bedtime stories and talking about everything and nothing. Weekends in Central Park, visiting the spot where their story had begun. Dinners where Sophia chattered excitedly about her day while Victoria listened with genuine interest, and Marcus marveled at how naturally they had become a family. The proposal, when it came, was as spontaneous as everything else about their relationship. They were back in Central Park, showing Sophia the ducks they'd fed on that first morning months earlier. Victoria was wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face reflecting the peace that came from finally being free. "Daddy, why are you looking at Victoria like that?" Sophia asked with the directness that had started everything. Marcus knelt down to his daughter's level, then looked up at Victoria. "Because I'm thinking about asking her to be part of our family forever." Sophia's eyes went wide with excitement. "Like get married? Would you like that?" "Yes," Sophia practically shouted, then turned to Victoria. "Would you want to be my mommy?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she knelt beside them both. "I would be honored to be your stepmother, Sophia, if your daddy asks me properly." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring he'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't the largest diamond or the most expensive setting, but it was perfect, elegant, timeless, and chosen with love rather than status in mind. "Victoria Sterling," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. "Will you marry me?" Her answer was yes, of course, sealed with a kiss that tasted like new beginnings and second chances. Sophia cheered and hugged them both, completely unself-conscious in her joy. The wedding, 6 months later, was small, but meaningful. They held it in the park where their story had begun, surrounded by close friends, and the few family members who mattered. Janet Morrison was there, having become an unlikely friend through their shared experience of fighting corruption. Sarah Chen covered the ceremony for the Society pages, writing a piece about love triumphing over adversity that became one of her most popular articles. But the most moving moment came during the reception, when Victoria gave a speech thanking everyone who had supported them. She talked about the kindness of strangers, the power of truth, and the way love could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Then she turned to Sophia, who was sitting at the head table in a miniature version of Victoria's dress. "And to Sophia," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for caring when I was forgotten, and for asking the question that changed all of our lives. You taught me that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages." Marcus watched his wife and daughter embrace, feeling Elena's presence in that moment more strongly than ever. He knew she would approve of the woman who had become Sophia's stepmother, who had brought love and stability back into their lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of family life. Victoria took a position as Chief Ethics Officer at Thornfield Industries, using her experience to help the company maintain the highest standards of corporate responsibility. Marcus found that having her as both a partner in life and business made him a better leader, more attuned to the human consequences of corporate decisions. Sophia thrived with Victoria's influence, developing into a child who was both privileged and grounded, aware of her advantages but also conscious of her responsibility to help others. She volunteered at homeless shelters, raised money for charity at school, and never passed someone in need without at least acknowledging their humanity. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The driven executive who had once measured success purely in financial terms now understood that true wealth came from relationships, integrity, and the ability to make a positive difference in the world. He established the Sterling Foundation in Victoria's honor, providing legal and financial support to corporate whistleblowers who found themselves facing the kind of systematic retaliation Victoria had endured. On the 5th anniversary of that first meeting in Central Park, the three of them returned to the oak tree where Victoria had been sleeping when Sophia first noticed her. The area had been transformed into a small memorial garden, with benches and flowers and a plaque that read, "Sometimes the questions of children lead to the most important answers." Victoria was pregnant by then, carrying the son who would complete their family and grow up hearing the story of how a 4-year-old's compassion had changed 3 lives forever. As they sat on the bench watching Sophia feed the ducks, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a simple question from a child who saw the world with clear eyes and an open heart. It had continued with the courage of a woman who refused to let injustice define her destiny. And it had culminated in the kind of love story that proved redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. The homeless woman sleeping under the oak tree that morning had been many things: a victim, a survivor, a fighter, and ultimately a hero. But most importantly, she had been exactly what Marcus and Sophia needed, even when they didn't know they needed her. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the most unlikely circumstances, and sometimes a child's innocent question can illuminate truths that adults have learned to ignore. As the sun set over Central Park, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus took Victoria's hand and squeezed gently. She squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was all the communication they needed. They had found their way home to each other through the darkest of circumstances, and nothing would ever separate them again. Their story had become legend in their circle of friends and colleagues, a reminder that justice and love could triumph over corruption and despair. But for Marcus, Victoria, and Sophia, it was simply their beginning, the foundation of a family built on truth, strengthened by adversity, and sustained by the kind of love that could weather any storm. Years later, when Sophia was older and asked her parents to tell her the story of how they met, Victoria would always begin the same way. It started with a question from a very wise little girl who wasn't afraid to see what others chose to ignore, and Marcus would add, and it continued because sometimes the people who seem to have nothing to offer have everything we need. The homeless woman sleeping outside had indeed been something extraordinary, not because of who she had been in her previous life, but because of who she chose to become in the face of unimaginable adversity. She had been a teacher, a healer, a bridge between worlds, and ultimately, the missing piece that transformed a house into a home and a father and daughter into a family. In the end, the most important discovery wasn't about Victoria's past or her innocence of the crime she'd been accused of committing. It was about the power of human connection to transcend circumstances, the importance of seeing dignity in every person regardless of their situation, and the truth that sometimes the most profound love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness. The question, "Mommy, why is that lady sleeping outside?" had indeed led to a discovery that changed everything. Not just the discovery of who Victoria Sterling really was, but the discovery of who Marcus and Sophia could become when they opened their hearts to someone the world had forgotten. In saving Victoria, they had ultimately saved themselves, proving that the greatest transformations often happen when we least expect them and are least prepared for their arrival. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.